All right, let's go ahead and kick things off here this morning. Welcome everybody to the ElevateIT TOLA Technology Summit. We're kicking off this morning's session with a presentation from Jody Davids, who has recently retired from PepsiCo as their global CIO. She has served as a global CIO for 3 Fortune 100 companies. And in addition to her successful career, she has a compelling life story, which we'll hear about this morning. She'll tell us all about this in her 45-minute presentation. At the end of her remarks, we'll have time to take questions. So please do use the chat function at the bottom of the screen to submit your questions throughout the presentations. I'll be reviewing and compiling questions to ask Jody live during the final 15 minutes or so of the session. Without further ado, Jody.
Good morning, and thanks, Casey, for having me this morning. I'm so excited about this event. We've been talking about it, I think you and I, since December. So it's great to finally have it here. Well, the topic I've chosen for this morning is thriving in extraordinary times. And I don't think anyone would doubt the fact that we actually are in some pretty extraordinary times. Before I launch into these comments, I'd like to, there we go. I'd like to share with you my career journey. And I'm going to mix in a little bit of my life story with it, because as I've found throughout my life and career, these two things are very intertwined. Really tough to separate the work from the life part of the work-life balance equation. So I started a long time ago at General Electric in San Jose, California, where I was born and raised in Silicon Valley, which I think shaped part of my story. Started as a secretary there. My mom was a secretary all her life. And to me, that was the highest calling, you know, the best thing I could do. And I took this role at General Electric, which wasn't far from my home. I happened to be in their nuclear energy business group. Well, this was, and General Electric had an incredible after hours training program. They trained me at one point. There was a course to learn Fortran programming. I joined the course. I did well. I got an entry-level programming job, and that is my entree into IT. That's how well thought out it was. But at the time, I was going to school at night, working on my bachelor's degree in business. I worked continuously on that. That took me about 8-9 years to finish. This time at GE, though, this was the early 80s, and an accident called 3 Mile Island occurred. And GE laid off loads of people. I was the newest programmer in the programming group, and I got let go. Best thing that ever happened to me, because what I did was, wander around Silicon Valley, landed a job at Apple Computer, where I worked for 15 years. Incredible place to grow up in my career. This was from 82 to 97. The product suite when I went there was an Apple II. They had the 2E and the 2C, and that was the product line. It was an incredible place to grow up at an incredible time in that company's history. Interesting though, and I grew there in my career, and it was at Apple, as I was progressing in my career in these 15 years, I set a goal to become the CIO of a Fortune 200 company, and I established a timeline. And during this whole period, I did a pretty good assessment of, I think, a pretty complete assessment of where I was ready to be a CIO, where I wasn't ready to be a CIO, where I would need to grow. And I, put into motion a plan to grow in those areas where I needed to. And so in fulfilling that personal mission, I left Apple after 15 years and went to Nike in Portland, Oregon. It wasn't a CIO position, but it was the role managing or leading all of Nike's global infrastructure. Nike, quite a global company, so it was a big global role. I stayed there 3 years or so. until I got a call from a recruiter about a company in Columbus, Ohio called Cardinal Health. And I honestly had never heard of Columbus, Ohio. I'd heard of it, but I had no idea where it was. I had to get out a map to find where it was. I'd never heard of Cardinal Health. And coming from these other 3 organizations, which had household names as brands, it was a bit of a tough mental gap for me to get over. But I did finally go and meet some folks at Cardinal Health, fell in love with the company, fell in love with their mission, and actually Columbus, Ohio. So which is where I'm sitting today. I came back after I retired. I came back from Plano, Texas to Columbus, where my son and my grandchildren are. I stayed at Cardinal Health for about 10 years. It was an incredible 10 years. In this period of time, Cardinal grew from about a $30 billion revenue company to a $100 billion revenue company. They did this through a series of acquisitions, divestitures, organic growth. It was like getting a second MBA. And yes, I had picked up an MBA after I finished my bachelor's degree. This was like a real life MBA with all of this business activity surrounding what I needed to do as part of my IT journey. And I went to Cardinal Health as a division CIO. Very shortly after that was named the global CIO. It was a great, great ride. But I left Cardinal Health after about 10 years for some very, very personal reasons. As I mentioned when I started, right, the life part and the career part, you can't separate these 2 parts of your life. And while I was at Cardinal Health, my oldest son, Wes, who had become a United States Marine, was killed in Iraq in 2005. Shortly after that, his brother, my younger son, Stephen, I had 2 sons, decided to honor his brother's memory by becoming a Marine. And Stephen deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. And I'm happy to say he's here now in Columbus, about 10 minutes from where I live. So that was a good story. But in one period of time, I lost my son, first son to death, second son left for military service. And then also in that period of time, my husband of 32 years left me for our cleaning lady. So you can see this was a period of some pretty significant personal turmoil. It was, this family of 4 living in the suburbs life that I lived was now a family of 1 living in the suburbs. And it was time for me to sort of figure out what I wanted to do next. So Cardinal Health, my boss came to me one day and said, as you know, we're getting ready to spin off part of our business to create another publicly traded company. We'd love you to stay. We need you to stay through the whole process. And at the end of this, you'll have your choice. You can either stay at Cardinal Health and do the job you're doing now, or you can go to the newly created company and do the same job there. Either way, we're delighted to, offer you these 2 options. You think about it over the weekend, come back and let us know what you'd like to do. I thought about it, and over the weekend, I came back and said, I'd like to leave at the end of this. I'll stay, I'll help you hire my successor, I'll help you hire the person who's going to do this work at the new company, but I need to leave and get my feet on the ground. So I did. I did my first retirement and that was from Cardinal Health. And the goal here was to get my feet on the ground again. Let's redefine what my life looks like, get, sort of a new foundation built and get started. So I left Cardinal intending to take 2 years off. Why 2 years? Well, I felt like it was going to take me a while to get my equilibrium back. And honestly, it takes a whole long time to find a new cleaning lady. So I left Cardinal Health and I didn't stay out for 2 years. It turned out to be about a year. I went to Best Buy, becoming their CIO, their CIO and leading their shared service business. Spent 3 years in Minneapolis, moved from there to a company, or I retired again from Best Buy the second time. You'll see here, there's hopefully this third retirement's a charm, but the first two didn't last very long. After my retirement, I went to a company called Agrium as a consultant. They soon asked me to stay and become their CIO, which I agreed to do on a contract, on a 2.5, 3-year contract, because my intention was to retire at the end of Agrium. Well, into that contract, PepsiCo called me, and it was just too good of a job to pass up. Look at all the logos on this sheet. PepsiCo was like the capstone of all of these experiences I'd had in my life. It turned out to be a wonderful opportunity. I joined PepsiCo on a 3-year contract, this time really intending to retire. I stayed the 3.5 years until they brought my successor on board, and I did retire last October. In the meantime, I had a career goal to serve on the board of a publicly traded company. And so Premier called me to serve in the 2015 timeframe, joined their board, and I expect I'll have another board or so, perhaps by the end of this calendar year. So that's the context for the remarks I want to make to you this morning. You know, there were some very, very long and very, very dark nights after I lost Wes. And some colleague from work, a great friend to this day, has handed me a book to read before Wes passed away. And it was sitting on the top of the stack on my bedside table. And one of those long, dark nights when I should have been sleeping, I opened it and I found this idea. You don't always get to choose what happens, but you do always get to choose how you respond to it. And I suppose I believed that and lived by those words throughout my life. But seeing them there on that page in that moment when I was seriously, losing the part of the very foundation of my life, these words resonated with me. So these words form the backdrop of what I'd like to talk with you about this morning, and that's how we thrive in extraordinary times. And I'm first a disclaimer, I am not a psychologist, I am not a scientist. I am a mom who's lost a son and had some other, sorts of traumas that I needed to live through. I'm a huge student of grief recovery, a huge student of leadership development, and strangely, I find that these two things intersect in some ways that are very meaningful to me. And those are the ideas I'll be sharing with you this morning. So if we think about thriving, the dictionary, Merriam-Webster's Unabridged Dictionary describes thriving like this: to grow vigorously or flourish, to gain in wealth or possessions or prosper, or to progress toward or realize a goal despite or because of circumstances. Often used with on, thrives on conflict, or like my little French bulldog pandemic puppy, thrives on attention. So I'm going to focus though in this first definition: to grow vigorously, to flourish. And all my comments this morning are aimed at flourishing, at growing, at thriving. I think this, again, not science. I'm not a psychologist, but my observation says there are 3 characteristics of thrivers, or people who thrive. I'm going to start with one you would expect: resilience. And I've symbolized it with the rising phoenix, but you would have expected me to say that. A thriver would be a resilient person. Grit. And the symbol of this is a book that I picked up that it had some pretty significant meaning and impact in my life. I'll be talking about this later. Resilience and grit. I'll bet the third characteristic I'm going to discuss with you this morning is not one you expected me to discuss in the context of thriving in extraordinary times. But the third idea is patience. And all 3 of these ideas they each feed the other, they're intertwined. So let's go through and talk about some of the key ideas here. And at the end of my conversation, I'm going to bring all of this together because there's one important idea that each of these three characteristics depends on. Let's talk about, and so let's get into that. I'm going to start with grit. And the Oxford Languages Dictionary defines grit as some small loose particles of stone or sand, not the way we're using the word, or courage and resolve, or strength of character. That's good. But the description of grit that I like comes from Angela Duckworth's book, Grit, The Power of Passion and Perseverance. Grit is a personality trait possessed by individuals who demonstrate passion and perseverance toward a goal, despite being confronted by significant obstacles and distractions. And it's the premise of her book. And let me go back and say, if you haven't read this book or understood these ideas, I would strongly encourage you to pick this up, because her work demonstrates that the biggest predictor of an individual's success is their grit and their capacity to have grit or to persevere through things, more so than raw talent. So I would encourage you to pick that up, but that's the prevailing idea. And she's a compelling storyteller. She tells the story in an incredible way. And it's one that you'll want to read through. She talks in the book about how to build grit in yourself and how to inspire it in your children. But she goes on in the book to say that people with grit have a never give up attitude. People with grit are paragons of perseverance, and in their own eyes, they're never good enough. This is an interesting idea. They feel like they're never as good as they're going to be tomorrow. But they're okay with that. They're satisfied to be slightly unsatisfied with the status quo. And people with grit possess a strong determination and clear direction. So the combination of determination and direction is paramount to people being able to demonstrate grit. But also important is a life philosophy. This direction takes the form of a life philosophy. It's a very high level direction, not the direction of, I just want to get through the day. I've got this task list, check, check, check. This is a life direction that helps you get through the day and get your task list done. A strong sense that this is what I want. I know what it is, and I want it so much. I'm determined to make it happen. She says that talent is no guarantee of grit. Our potential is one thing, but what we do with it is quite another. And her premise, and she backs this up with interesting research, is that someone twice as talented but half as hardworking as another might reach the same level of skill, but they would produce dramatically less over time. Really interesting book. I encourage you to pick it up. But one point is, I mean, if you're sitting out there saying, I don't have grit, I'm not a person that has these ideas already embedded in my psyche, do I give up on this? No, you don't give up on it. Her premise is that grit grows. Research reveals the psychological assets that mature paragons of grit have in common. She calls them this, mature paragons of grit. First is interest. Enough interest to create a passion that makes you, and she says you'll perform more if you intrinsically enjoy what you do. So you need to have interest in what you do. And then the capacity to practice, the daily discipline of trying to do things better than you did yesterday. And this is where you look at concert pianists, renowned concert pianists or Olympic athletes. These people they're not born, they don't come out of the womb, breaking records at the Olympics. They've somehow had the daily discipline combined with the interest. And then the third idea, the purpose. They combine this, the conviction that your work matters makes you more passionate about your work. There's a role here that we as leaders can play in helping our teams understand how their work matters to us, to us achieving the overall purpose. But these people, she said, all have this hope that threads throughout all of these, the other three characteristics. So this hope is a kind of a rising to the occasion sort of perseverance. I can do this, right? I don't know how, but I'll figure it out. I can rise to the occasion and make it happen. And hope is important in all the stages of grit. And she says at various points, in big ways, in small ways, we get knocked down. If we stay down, that's not grit. If we get up, grit prevails. So that's grit. That's one of the characteristics that people need to grow, have, and or grow in order to thrive. She says in the book, and she does have a scale, a grit scale online. You can go and take a quiz and she'll give you a score and tell you what that score means. But she says that people, as they age, develop more grit. So it is something that you grow. People in their 60th and 70th decades develop and are able to demonstrate more grit than they could when they were younger. Let's move on to the next topic, resilience. Resilience is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties or toughness. We hear this word all the time. It's an ability to recover from, adjust easily to misfortune or change, an occurrence of rebounding or springing back. Probably the most common way that we use it. It's sort of springing back or coming back to the way we were. Resilience, another trait that you're not born with. You can build this. In fact, you build it through dealing successfully with adversity. I've worked for more than one company that in its interview processes, when we're interviewing entry-level people who don't have a strong, resume of experience to talk to us about, we like to hire people who were athletes in their youth, because as an athlete, you learn that you don't win every time. You learn the trait of, if you don't win, analyzing what it was, working hard to work through all of that so that you have the hope that you can win again. It's a trait that we develop we can develop as children or not. And there are some incredible studies talking about resilient people who started in the most adverse of circumstances, who work through that with the help of some great role modeling or some inspiration that gets to them and helps them deal successfully with this. Resilience, the key to surviving devastating events, possibly growing through them and prospering through upheavals. One really interesting idea here is this point at the bottom of the slide. Resilience is considered a personality trait, but organizations can learn a culture of resilience, creating the ability to more quickly and effectively recover when something goes wrong. There's a Harvard Business Review study on this. In fact, I've worked on this in organizations that I've led. There are people who will help you. They'll advise you. What does a resilient culture look like? How do you measure your current organization's level of resilience? And from there, how do you build it up? And so if any of you are leaders out there and you'd like some direction around who you could go to talk about this, I strongly recommend this as you're thinking about your culture and you're thinking about how to build your culture and the people inside of the culture, your organization, to have a more resilient attitude. Another work tells us that the 3 traits of resilient people. Resilient people staunchly accept reality. You have perspective that says, okay, I see, this is where we are. It's not the same anymore. This is where we are. Let's figure out where we go from here. And they also have a sense of boundaries. So think about you as an individual, and you had an experience in your life that feels very personal. For example, let's just say your husband leaves you for the cleaning lady, or let's just say you get a bad performance review at work. People with resilience can put a fence around that. So they say, all right, I had a terrible performance review. I didn't do well in this one circumstance, but I am not a failure. I may have failed in this thing, but I am not a failure. Let's figure out how to build on the parts of me that are not a failure and move on, and how to make myself better. Resilient people have a deep belief that life is meaningful. And this is all underpinned by some very strongly held values, or a life purpose, or some strong direction. If you're going to glean a theme here through these three, the resilience, grit, and patience stories that we'll talk about this morning. And resilient people tend to have a growth mindset and an uncanny ability to improvise, like MacGyver number one. So there are traits of resilient people. And the point here is that you don't have to be born resilient. You can become resilient by practicing, looking at these traits, practicing your way through recovering from setbacks. I think, though, a challenge that we need to think about when we talk about resilience, our propensity when we experience a setback is to get back to normal incredibly quickly. This is our desire, but it's not a realistic expectation because the world has changed in some way. There is no normal to get back to. Your experience has changed your perspective. In my case, the example, right? I lost my son. While I'd like to get back to normal was never going to be the dinner around the table with the two sons and the husband. That was not going to be it anymore because that had changed. I owned the job of determining what the new normal was going to be and fitting into it and growing into it. And it was my choice. I could figure it out. We talk about this idea of springing back to normal. My idea isn't that. Back doesn't work. Back to me connotes backward. I like the idea of springing forward. And this is the growth idea, right? So when you suffer a setback, figure out your new normal, but how do you grow through that? How does the new normal become forward from the old normal? So back to this is my life philosophy. You don't always get to choose what happens, but you do always get to choose how you respond to it. The question for you is, do you want to bounce back or do you want to bounce forward? Let's go to patience now. And I'm guessing all of you were a little bit surprised to see this on the list of someone who thrives and, frankly, a great leader, someone recovering from some kind of a major setback. We just want to get there faster. Patience is described as the bearing of provocation, annoyance, misfortune, or pain without complaint, loss of temper, or anger. It's an ability or willingness to suppress restlessness or annoyance when confronted with delay. A quiet, steady perseverance, even-tempered care, diligence. And some really big thinkers in our world, and this is one quote, and there are many out there, but John Ruskin in the 19th century, a significant thinker and I've studied some of his work, but his idea here is that on the whole, it's patience that makes the final difference between people who succeed or fail in everything. He says all the greatest people have it in an infinite degree, and among the less, the patient weak ones always conquer the impatient strong. You might be saying, well, that was fine in the 19th century, but now things move so quickly, I don't have time for patience. Well, and it's true, our natural instinct in extraordinary times is to act, but patience is not inaction. Patience is not sitting on the porch in a rocking chair, waiting for something to happen or waiting for something to come to you. A patient person goes about the day as they need to go about it, but they take some time to be intentional. Sit back and say, okay, what is just enough time to begin to collect some data points. What's changing in this situation? Does my purpose still make sense? Is my purpose still valid? For the most part, if your purpose is high level enough, it's absolutely still valid. But but you have the time now to develop a plan that takes some new data points into account. You can assess your plan. Do I have what I need to execute this? Fill your gaps with new plans, new resources if you can't execute it, and focus on executing it. But the idea with patience here isn't to sit and wait. The idea is to be intentional in watching and timing, and keeping a cool head. The definitions you saw on the first page were about how you act through this, through the extraordinary times, or through the times of difficulty. It's how you act in those times, or how you behave in those times. Because as they say, cooler heads always do prevail. You've heard all these sayings throughout your life. Patience is a virtue, and I truly believe that it is. This article I read an article by Sherry Campbell. It's attributed here. She goes through in some pretty great detail the 8 benefits of being patient in the business world. And it comes down to, you have the time and the perspective to make better decisions. You build a better reputation, but self-possession is an important one. You stay in control of yourself through the situation, whatever it is. You grow better tolerance. Your hope is better. If you've got sort of a bit of intention about you, your results are just going to be better. Patience, a very, very important virtue of people who thrive. So I've gone through at some high level detail the characteristics of these thrivers. And there was one important theme of each of people who are resilient, people who demonstrate grit, and people who are patient. There was one idea that threaded through all of these. There are many, in fact, but the important one that I'd like to talk to you about this morning is the idea of purpose. So it's important. A resilient person is driven by purpose. A person who demonstrates grit is driven by a strong purpose. A patient wow, this is a tongue twister. A patient person driven by a strong purpose to be patient and to make sure that everything they're doing, their intention, the way they do act, is driven by purpose. In fact, imagine in a resilient person, if you're anxious to bounce back to normal, but you haven't taken the time to assess what normal might look like for you, given the changes around you. It might be changes in your business world. It might be changes in your personal life. It might be a world pandemic. In any event, a resilient person, has an advantage, but it needs to be combined with patience. Otherwise, you're going to be bouncing in directions that might not serve you well at the end. There's a really strong power in a life lived with purpose. And I have one story that is, to me, a perfect demonstration of a life filled with purpose, a very personal demonstration. I told you at the beginning of this time together that my oldest son, Wesley, a Marine, was killed in Iraq. Now, Wesley became a Marine because of actions that happened on September 11th, 2001. He was a sophomore in high school, and he saw the planes fly. He was at school, just like we were. We can all remember where we were. He was in high school, and every classroom, they had brought televisions in. They were watching the planes over and over fly into those buildings, the buildings crumbling all day long at school. He watched that. We came home that night to dinner, as we did every night, and had conversation about our day. And he declared to us at that point, he was going to do something that would prevent someone from ever again attacking us on our own soil. Now, these are the words of a 15, 16-year-old boy in high school. But he felt this strong compulsion, and he declared this. It became his purpose. He spent the next years of school preparing, and he decided, after a few months that what he wanted to do was join the United States Marines because they were the best of, in his mind, of all of the military institutions in our country. He wanted to be part of the best, and he wanted to do what he could to prevent this ever happening again. He lived his life with that strong purpose. He went to boot camp. He did some training. He was eventually deployed to Iraq, and you know the outcome there. But this life of purpose was not wasted. His brother followed his lead. His brother honored Wesley's purpose by creating his own life of purpose. And Stephen wasn't quite as compelled by September 11th as his brother had been, but his purpose became honoring his brother's memory. My life changed. My purpose, my approach to developing leaders. Those of you who've worked with me or know anything about me know that this is one of the things. This is my passion. It's developing people for positions of leadership and watching people grow in their leadership careers. I'm proud to say one of the ways I measure my success in that regard is the number of folks in my organizations who've gone on to become CIOs, either in the organization or in a place where I left the role, or they've left the organization to become a CIO. And I take great pride in having been a part of their story. But I do a ton of coaching, leadership coaching, and this is driven by my purpose. And my approach to leadership changed pretty significantly after Wes passed on. I became a much more people-oriented leader. I began to appreciate things differently. So and after Wesley's experience in the Marine Corps, 3 of his friends joined the Marine Corps, and I watched their careers, and they're living amazing lives as fathers and people who are serving in their communities. One life of purpose, I can see probably 10 lives whose purpose changed or was impacted by that. So don't underestimate the importance of a life of purpose. And if you don't have yours well understood, I would encourage you to take this time to understand it. As we talk about resilience and grit and patience, you know, the question is, aren't people born with these things? And is it too late for me to develop these? The answer is no to all. All of these are behaviors and traits that can be learned, developed, managed, and grown over a lifetime. And I would encourage you, again, get the Angela Duckworth book on grit. There's lots of writings on resilience, lots of writings on patience, but these are behaviors that you can grow over your lifetime, and they will serve you well. Because as we're talking about thriving in extraordinary times, these skills also serve you in ordinary times, and you develop them in ordinary times so that in extraordinary times they're ready and they're strong and you're good to go. Just a few other things to remember before I close here. First, always surround yourself with the best people you can find. Relentlessly practice gratitude. I established a gratitude journal when I was going through some pretty dark times in my life, and I didn't think I had anything to be grateful for. It changed my complete approach to the way I saw my life and the way I understood the blessings that I have in my life. I would strongly encourage you, if you're, to begin to practice gratitude, and a gratitude journal is one way to do that. Make sure in these times that you're taking time to take care of yourself. Make sure you're getting enough sleep. Practice mindfulness. It goes back to the idea of intention and patience. Honor your feelings. And I'm saying experience them, right? If you're frustrated, if you're annoyed, if you're impatient, if you're, whatever it is you are experiencing, experience it, but not for very long. You got to be careful not to live in those feelings and not to dwell in them. They can't control your life. You need to think again what your higher purpose is and make sure your intention is all around getting your achievement of that higher purpose in your life. Lastly, keep a sense of humor and be kind to people around you. It's going to help you get through all of these times. And there is humor in this world that we're living in all of these things that we're all experiencing. We have plenty to be grateful for, plenty to smile about. Remember, while adversity may bring the end of something, it can become the beginning of something even greater. And the choice is yours. Thank you. I'll turn it back to you, Casey, if you'd like to open it up for questions.
Thank you very much, Jody. We've had a pretty robust comment section here, question and answer section. Couple of the questions here. The one that I want to start with is from Randy. It says many companies are moving from the deployment of products in their data center to evolving to the use of third-party services in the cloud. What is the future role of the CIO in the next 5 years? Do you believe companies will continue managing data centers and augmenting with cloud services, or do you believe companies will fully evolve to a portfolio of cloud-based services?
Wow. Okay. So I'm going to go to I'll answer the second question quickly and then spend some time on the role of the CIO as people go to cloud, which is interesting. But so will companies continue to manage their own data centers? This is a big, it depends, because it goes to the role of the CIO. The CIO's role is to understand the business, the strategy, become part of the strategy of the organization they serve. And there are going to be times when the right thing to do is to move your data to a cloud. There are going to be times and people and organizations who believe the right thing to do is to keep it in their own data center. These are, I can't say with certainty that everything's going to the cloud, but I can certainly say trend-wise, it's looking that way. It's a trend, but a big it depends answer. It depends on your company and you. The role of the CIO is not to manage the data center. So the role of the CIO isn't going to change and it isn't going to go away. The role of the CIO, again, is to deliver all the technology that's going to make that strategy, that company's strategy, come to life. So it's not about managing the data center. Data center is one aspect of it. Applications are one aspect. It's our job to bring it all together to build out the strategy of the company that the CIO is serving.
Okay, fantastic. The next question here is from Michelle. During these challenging times, there is need and opportunity for leadership teams. Instead, I'm witnessing a disturbing trend where many male leaders are passing the buck, deferring and even formally delegating the emotional labor in their organization to others. Given your experience, how would you coach a leadership team? What advice would you give a diversity female leader who finds herself in that situation?
That's an interesting question. It sounds very personal, right? So it's, I don't know the male leaders and the female leaders, but in general, I would say, as if I'm a leader if I'm a leader in an organization, it's my job to find my voice and find a way, patiently, find a way to help my leader understand what I'm seeing, right? Not in an accusatory, this is what's happening, why are you doing this kind of a way, but in a way that says, I'm one person, let's step back because we've been going through some interesting times here. Here's what I'm seeing as a result of the way we're working now. Here's what I'd like to see. Can we talk through some options for working to a better outcome? And I think it all needs to focus on the outcome of the business. Sometimes it's, the experience of the individuals, yep, it's a concern, but if you can focus on the outcomes of the business, speak with some examples, with some data, and bring some ideas for the table around how to improve it, I guess that would be a starting point.
Fantastic. Solomon had a question here, starting out obviously by saying many thanks for sharing your story with us. You mentioned that you did a detailed assessment of the requirements to be a CIO and how you fared against each one of these. Can you elaborate on what you see are the key qualifications of a CIO role in these times?
Yeah. So this was an assessment I did 100 years ago. It was when I was young. It seems like that. I would say, in my mind, I was looking at pretty big ideas, right? And the first one is, do I know the business? Can I speak the language of the business? Do I have the skills to deliver the solutions that the business needs to them? And that's, in essence, the top level, because that's the essence of the job of the CIO, is to, sit at the table, be a part of creating the strategy for the business, making sure all the resources we own are pointed at making that strategy come to life. And so then from there, you go down and you say, okay, so now all of the resources I own what are they? And do I have everything that I need to own? Is there more? How do you get these resources mobilized and pointed at the direction of the company, right? So there's layers of assessment. But one thing that I did was I also got feedback from other people. So I did some interviews, said, all right, what do you think the job of the CIO is? Okay. And then I brought that back. I got some job descriptions that I saw out in the public domain. And I took that back. And then I interviewed people and said, okay, I've done a little assessment. Here's where I think I meet the requirements. And here's where I think I need to grow some more. Is there anything I'm missing here? So I would say that was, that's very, very important, is to include people in the dialogue, not too many, just people that you can really trust and who have the perspective that you need. Don't be afraid to ask for feedback. Very, very important. I got some really good feedback, because part of the job, it's not just about knowing the applications and running the data center. It's about the way you communicate with executives. This thing called executive presence is very, very important. And if you're interested at all in rising through the ranks, you need to learn what this thing is. And it means something different in every company. It's almost cultural. And you need to figure out how to build your own version of executive presence, show up, communicate as a credible member of the leadership team, and not as the technology guy sitting in the corner. And the same is true if you want to become a board member. You're sitting at the board table as a board director, not as a CIO, who knows technology, sitting on the board. Yes, that was my expertise coming up through the ranks, but you need to be able to ask questions that are general enough, broad enough, strong enough to get at, other issues in the company.
Fantastic. We had another question here from Chandra. Chandra would like to understand what courageous ethical leadership means and how all of us can coach our global workforce to be courageous.
Okay, that's a question good for a whole presentation. I love the idea of courage. I absolutely do, and I have been called a courageous leader. But creating and so that it starts with you, the leader, I think. But I've joined organizations that weren't courageous, and they should have been courageous, right? But they weren't. And so my job as a leader was to build that courage. And the way to do that is just to, to coach an organization, first of all, your leadership team. Have some candid conversations. What are some signs? Are we courageous? Have a dialogue with the leadership team. Are we courageous? If not, what are the major symptoms that you see that say we're not? Well, in my example, one symptom is nobody will tell their boss what's really happening because they're afraid they're going to get beat up. Well, they're only going to get beat up so many times before they stop telling their boss. So a courageous culture a courageous culture, how do I say this? A courageous organization, courage is only one aspect of the culture. You also have to have, you have to create aspects of the culture that allow courage to thrive. An aspect that says, all right, we're okay receiving bad news. So the culture has to be one of open communication. So courage is one aspect of a culture. And I would say when you get into understanding and assessing your own organization, are we courageous? What are the symptoms of that lack of courage if you're not courageous? And then figure out all the things you need to do to get at that. That's the right start.
Wonderful. Marty P. asked, how did your role as a CIO change over the years with the different companies that you serve?
Yeah, so you'll notice on my experience slide, my resume slide, my logo slide, none of the companies I worked at were in the same industry. All different industries. The thread that ran through all of that was IT and supply chain. I picked up a bit of a supply chain expertise at Apple Computer. So first of all, it wasn't imperative for me to go from, to stay within healthcare, for example, or stay within retail. I took my skills, and so those were my technical skills, IT, supply chain, and leadership. Leadership and leadership development was my thing. And I moved to all those great companies on that sort of platform. The role of the CIO, my first CIO role was at Cardinal Health. I don't know that the role of the CIO changes at its top level. I would say more and more the businesses are demanding the CIO be a part of the business because business is becoming more and more digital, right? And that's all in our space. So as business aspirations become more digital, we get a stronger voice. We're expected to bring more strength to the table than probably we were. I would say in my first CIO role, and I've been in others where I'm sure I showed up and I'm not sure anyone had any idea what the CIO should do. And it was sort of my job to help them see what my role was and why I fit there, and why the CIO fit, not me personally, but why they needed a CIO, what value the CIO and the organization was going to create. But I would say, if anything, at the top level, it's know where the business is going, build the relationships with the executives that give you and deliver the goods that give you the credibility to deliver it at its top level. Over time, though, the demands have become greater as digital companies want to become more and more digital. I would say maybe to add to that, in addition to being a digital, someone who helps make digital happen, another expectation would be that we understand business transformation. And it's because usually there's business transformation involved in creating a digital experience. And people in their roles need to perform differently. It's all about understanding how the technology serves the business. And sometimes we're the evangelists that have to help the other business execs become aware of that.
Fantastic. I think we've got time for just two more questions here. Lola K asked, what path did you develop for yourself to become a CIO?
What path? Okay, I was already in IT. And I was already at the director level in my organization. So it was kind of a second, third level management experience from the bottom, in the Apple organization. So the path for me depended, because I started midway, it was sort of, what have I already done? What do I still need to do? And what I felt I still needed to do was, I personally wanted experience in different kinds of business. I'd worked in Apple my whole career and it was great, but I'd seen the world from Silicon Valley perspective, which isn't the whole world. So I chose to change companies to get my next step up, and I chose to move completely in a different direction in IT. But that was my choice And so I started in applications and solution delivery. I moved into infrastructure. And what I got out of that as we outsourced a lot of that infrastructure was a real understanding of the business of IT. Here's the IT budget. Here's what we spend it on. Here, let's benchmark against what other opportunities there are, not just from a financial perspective, but from a service delivery perspective, and make sure that we're delivering the most for the money that our company's spending on IT. My path might not be the path that you take. So I would just encourage you to know what interests you. If you want to become the CIO, be honest about, here's what I have, here's what I need, and be intentional about completing the here's what I need part of your journey.
All right, and let's go ahead and wrap it up with Michelle's questions here. As females continue to be minorities in the technology industry, how did you work through not seeing many women as your colleagues?
That's an interesting question. Honestly, I went to work every day and I didn't show up thinking, okay, I'm a woman and these are all men. I grew up in Silicon Valley where there was just a thirst for talent. And yes, there was more male talent than female talent, but I had my eye on the higher purpose, which at some point was to become a CIO. And in that quest, I didn't see gender. I didn't see race. I saw, here's what I want to do. Here are the colleagues that are here and that are, that I'm working with. And here are the people that can help me. And yes, my communications style probably needed to be different than a man's, but I didn't quite say it to myself like that. It was, okay, I need to be a stronger communicator. I'm watching myself in a meeting, being kind of honest about my performance versus my peers in other areas. Okay, here's where I did great, and here's where I need to do better. My confidence level needed to be built up. And I would say that's thing one. Most women that I coach have very low levels of confidence in their own ability, low levels of confidence to set and achieve very bold goals. And it's about, you have to bolster your own self-confidence. Some of this comes from within. Some of it you'll achieve through a mentor or a coach. But it's just about knowing yourself and what you want, being in charge of your own goal and not looking at the environment around you as an obstacle. And if it doesn't work for you where you are in your company, go to another company who will be delighted to have you. I mean, you don't have to spend your whole career in one place. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Jody. We've had a couple requests for the slides, so I think you and I could talk about that online so they can be distributed. Thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your experiences. It was a pleasure having you, and we look forward to hearing perspectives and having you engage throughout the show as well, and talk with the other folks